This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. This Week in Virology, Episode 3, October 2nd, 2008. I'm Vincent Racaniello.
And I'm Dick Despommier.
How are you been, Dick?
I've been well, Vince. You had a good week?
Yes. Have you built any vertical farms?
No, in my dreams.
It's a beautiful day. No rain today.
Nope.
What are we talking about today?
We had a little rain yesterday, though, so that might have jump-started a few batches of mosquitoes. Yep, I think so.
Weather is hard to predict, isn't it?
It's impossible.
Dick, I know we're talking about dengue today.
Yep.
But before we do, I found a news item which we should discuss because it's timely.
Very good.
Every day I scour the internet for articles on viruses, and do you know what most of the returns are about? Computer viruses. And some of them are about the viruses that infect you, which is what we talk about on this podcast.
Exactly.
And listen to this headline. Researchers link home foreclosures to West Nile virus outbreaks. So apparently, we're having a financial crisis.
Yep.
Everyone seems to know except John McCain, right? We can't be political in this podcast, otherwise people won't listen to us.
Exactly right.
In California, a study was done, and this is published in the journal called Emerging Infectious Diseases, which is a publication of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And we will put the link in the show notes for this. It's an article coming out in the November issue, and the article is entitled Delinquent Mortgages, Neglected Swimming Pools, and West Nile Virus, California.
Wow.
The idea is that when people lose their houses, the pools, the swimming pools, the jacuzzis, and the ornamental ponds become polluted.
Yep.
Because they have fences around them. No one can get in to spray them. And as it says here, as chemicals deteriorate, invasive algal blooms create swimming pools that are exploited rapidly by urban mosquitoes. So they did a study in swimming pools and so forth in California and found many mosquitoes carrying West Nile virus. Are you surprised by this at all?
Actually, I'd like to invoke a Yogi Berra quote here, if you wouldn't mind. It's déjà vu all over again.
Déjà vu all over again.
Well, because in 1999, that exact same thing happened in northern Queens, and people, because of the increased electric bills that they were getting, if they had the option, they went on vacation and they went somewhere else where it was nice and cool, but they turned off their pumps, which filtered the water in their swimming pools, generating an ecosystem for Culex pipiens, which is a pollution-loving mosquito, as we discussed. And that was the jumpstart for the initial outbreak in northern Queens. And here you are talking about 2008, and under the heading Lessons Unlearned, or Lessons Not Learned, the same scenario happens in another place. Now, do we have to reinvent this wheel for every section of the country before everybody understands that polluted water, hot temperatures, and urban mosquitoes have the potential for jump-starting outbreaks of West Nile virus in people?
Well, I think when people lose their homes, there's not much they can do, right?
No, there isn't.
Law states you have to lock the fence around the pool.
That's
so
true.
The people who are doing spraying can't get in to spray the pool.
That's
so
right.
what should be done?
Well, empty the pool, for one thing. If you're not going to use it, empty it.
So the people who leave should empty it.
Of course, but that doesn't avoid rainfall filling it back up partially again.
Yes.
But it certainly limits the amount of ecosystem
The problem,
available.
Dick, is that certain kinds of pools, gunite concrete pools, you can't empty them or else they'll pop out of the ground from the hydrostatic pressure. So you need to leave some water in to keep them in the ground.
Covering them.
Covering them. Would that keep the mosquitoes out?
Depends on how tight the cover is, but I mean, they should be covered anyway to keep little kids from wandering into them.
No, they have a fence around them.
The fence is there, okay. So I would say a tight-fitting cover.
Would the cover stop the algal blooms?
Yeah, because you're sealing off sunlight.
And would that reduce the mosquito infestation significantly?
Significant. If they don't have any food, they're not going to inhabit that.
Now, listen to this statement here, which you might find interesting.
Sure.
During 2008, many of the pools previously positive for Culex pipiens were now positive for Culex tarsalis.
A look-alike species.
It says a more competent vector of West Nile virus.
That's right.
Meaning the virus is spread more readily in this vector, grows better.
All of the above.
All of the above. So a change in mosquito populations is also a problem.
Right. As we mentioned before, the strain of the virus has changed. So now you've got a brand new species of mosquito implicated in the outbreaks, and you've got a brand new strain of the virus in the outbreaks. I think this is proof positive that creationists just don't have it right.
That's right. Here's evolution right in front of our eyes.
That's
right?
exactly it.
So it's unfortunate when you lose your home, the last thing on your mind is to take care of your swimming pool.
That's true.
But there has to be some system put in place, especially in warm climates, where we can take care of the pools. Otherwise, we're going to have more human disease.
No question about it. So another way to solve this problem is to use a larvicide, which is non-toxic to anything else and just physically blocks their ability to breathe. Because the larvae have these little snorkels that they use to stick up above the water surface, but they feed under the water. So there are many, many different substances which are inert, basically like oils, for instance, that you could make as a thin surface over the top, which would completely eliminate the possibility of mosquitoes breeding in those places. So that's another approach that I just thought of as we were talking.
And of course, if you chlorinate properly, the mosquitoes won't breed, or
yeah, I'd avoid chlorine because of the implications for the ozone depletion in the stratosphere.
No, but people use that to sanitize their pools.
Oh, but of course they do. But of course they do.
Maybe we could select for a chlorine-resistant mosquito.
Also possible.
What's the larvicide consist of?
The chlorine would be inhibiting the food of the mosquito, not the mosquito itself, I think.
Oh, okay. It inhibits the algae growth, right?
Exactly right.
Algicides and chlorines. Well, if you don't have money for your mortgage, you're not going to have money for chlorine and algicides.
But certainly the local public health officials should realize this too, and as best they can, triage this problem and identify the hotspots in the neighborhoods.
Right.
Now, anybody with a pool, it seems to me, that's fairly affluent people as far as I can see.
Not necessarily.
Well, I understand this. I mean, I think there's a lot of borrowed money out there that just had to come home to the bank, and there was no way for them to pay it. So you're right. I mean, people living way beyond their means, and diseases take advantage of this, don't they?
Yes. I mean, if the house is not going to be sold for a while, I think you're right. It needs to fall into the purview of the public health department,
That's right.
which means another burden for them, more costs for them to put the pool on their list and take care of it.
California happens to be one of those enlightened states that has maintained a mosquito control board throughout the entire state. Every county has a mosquito control board, so I don't think it's going to be that much of a burden, to be honest with you. And I think the same is true for states like New Jersey. They have 21 counties in New Jersey, and every one of them has a mosquito control board.
That's correct. That is correct,
so
yes.
The need to invent a wheel isn't there for these two states. These are two of the shining examples of the way public health should work to protect the citizens from outbreaks, and here's one of the things they need to get on the stick about.
Okay.
So it's back, it's back.
It's very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out.
Dick, do any of these mosquitoes in the swimming pools in California carry the virus of dengue fever?
The answer is no.
Is it in the U.S. at all?
Oh, yeah.
So let's talk about dengue.
Sure. That's another flavivirus. That's a nice segue.
It's related to West Nile. It's the same family.
That's correct.
Flaviviridae, or
right.
flaviviruses.
Yep.
Very well.
Yep.
Should we put a picture in the enhanced podcast?
I think it would be essential.
Very good. What do we know about dengue?
What we know about dengue is that it's carried by the same mosquito species that carries yellow fever.
Which is?
Aedes aegypti.
Different from Culex now.
Correct. Much different. In fact, it's as different as living in an apartment versus living in a freestanding home with lots of lawn around it. When you compare the lifestyles of those two people, they're totally different. When you compare the lifestyles of Culex species and Aedes species, you've got two completely different breeding strategies and biting strategies and host preferences and biologies. In fact, if you were to really do a complete description of mosquito biology, you would say that virtually every species has a unique lifestyle. And some have commonalities, like all of the Aedes species are temporary water breeders. Mm-hmm. But as we'll describe the biology of this mosquito and to show you how difficult, without knowing what its life cycle is like, to get rid of it, and we mentioned the fact that it does transmit yellow fever as well as dengue fever. This was the species of mosquito they needed to identify in order to complete the Panama Canal project. Mm-hmm. Without knowing where this mosquito breeds, you would continue to die from massive epidemics of dengue fever, or rather yellow fever, during the digging of this very important man-made structure. So it has a rich history in...
So in order to complete the canal, it was necessary to have mosquito control in the region, in the canal zone. And this was specifically for the Aedes
That's
mosquito.
Right. They knew it was mosquito-borne at the time, but they didn't know which mosquito. So
who figured out what mosquito it was?
Well...
Was that Walter Reed?
It was Walter Reed, but he had a lot of help from his Cuban friends.
And how were the mosquitoes wiped out eventually? With DDT?
Actually, no. They were wiped out environmentally.
Environmental controls.
That's correct. And once you know where these mosquitoes are breeding, in temporary bodies of water associated with discarded items, like tin cans, for instance, that people were using, like K-rations, for instance. You'd open a can of beans, you'd eat the beans and throw the can away. This was the workers, all right? When it rained, of course, often in the tropics, these cans would fill up with water and then they would start to empty. When they're about half empty, they start to give off an odor which attracts the right mosquito to it, namely Aedes aegypti. Aedes aegypti then, unlike Culex, lays its eggs near the edge of the water. Culex lays their eggs on the water. Anopheles on the water. So the rafts of eggs are easy to identify. You don't see the eggs of Aedes aegypti because they stick to the sides of the can or the turned over boat or the tire that's discarded. And so what happens is the water continues to evaporate. The eggs dry out. So almost like freeze-dry eggs, okay? But they're alive.
They're preserved, yes. They're still alive. Mm-hmm.
Which is a miracle because everybody thinks of mosquitoes and water. With Aedes aegypti, what they think about is the next rain. So the first rain supplies the water level that they need to start with. And then as the water evaporates, the eggs just sit and they wait. Now when it rains again, if the rain water exceeds the level of the eggs are now submerged in water. They revive, they hatch. They know there's enough water to carry out their life because they judged how much water was there to begin with. So they've got enough water to complete about 1.5 weeks worth of biology, which is what it takes to go from the egg to the adult.
Now, in a jungle where there aren't cans or boats, where would the mosquitoes breed?
Well, the other name for this mosquito is tree hole breeding mosquito. So there's tons of tree holes. Birds make holes like woodpeckers and hornbills and all these other wonderful tropical birds. Not necessarily woodpeckers, but hornbills and other animals also burrow down into the bark of trees and make their nests there. When they abandon them after the breeding season, these become the breeding sites for Aedes aegypti.
So this, during the construction of the canal, these were presumably the problematic sites. And then as workers moved in, they left their cans around, and that added to the problem.
No question.
So how did they got rid of the cans by diligence? What about the tree holes? Did they have to address those as well?
They did not,
no.
In fact. All they had to do was police the area. It's essentially the same problem you just pointed out for West Nile in California. If you police the area and look for the breeding sites and you identify them, the best approach is to illuminate the environment rather than spraying or vaccines and stuff like that. So it was actually quite simple once they determined which species of mosquito was at fault here. But there were some tragedies associated with determining that, which violates current IRB regulations.
IRB is Institutional
Review Boards. There's a lot of unethical... We would consider it unethical behavior now by actually subjecting human beings to clinical trials where mosquitoes that were deemed dengue or yellow fever free were allowed to feed on patients suffering from yellow fever, and then each species of mosquito was allowed to feed on a group of volunteers. Well, some of those volunteers actually went to medical school here, Vince, at Columbia University.
Yes. Some of them were also scientists who subjected themselves to it, and they died.
This is very true.
Didn't Clara Moss die from such an experiment?
Yes,
or
that's
just
right.
At least being bitten by an infected mosquito.
That's correct.
So it's the same species of mosquito that carries dengue virus.
It is.
And what should we worry about dengue in the U.S.?
Well, it depends on how much you like to worry. We've had outbreaks in the southern part of Texas in recent past. They're sporadic outbreaks. They're not permanent outbreaks.
Okay.
But we used to have dengue fever here a lot.
Maybe we should say first what dengue fever is.
Oh, okay.
What does dengue mean, the word?
I wish I could tell you.
Is it the name of a city?
I don't know the origin of that.
Right, we'll have to look it up. We'll put it on our show notes.
Does anyone out there know what the origin of dengue is? It's probably a place because most viruses are named after the place they were first isolated from. And, you can do this for hantavirus. That's the Hantan River in Korea. You can do it for Ebola. That's a town in West Africa.
Now, how did we get to yellow fever, Dick?
Do it for Lassa.
Because you look yellow when you're jaundiced, when your liver is infected, right?
Correct. That's exactly right.
So dengue, there are two kinds of dengue, right? There are 4 serotypes, but in terms of disease, right?
Right. There are just 2 kinds.
So there are 4 serotypes of the virus, which is important. And antibodies, you need antibodies against all of them to protect you. And there are 2 kinds of illness.
That's
right?
correct.
Tell us about that.
Well, the first kind is a fever, obviously, that's created by the viremia that you develop. But it's usually a mild fever, followed by what you would call arthritic-like syndrome.
Joint pain.
Yeah, the other name for this is breakbone fever. Mm-hmm. You feel as though your joints are going to come apart, and you're in pain constantly throughout your whole body. And it lasts for about 2 weeks. And then you recover, and then you're all better. That's disease number 1. That's called
dengue fever. Is that correct?
That's dengue fever. Then there's another form of this, which is the most unfortunate form of this. It's the lethal form called dengue hemorrhagic fever.
Okay, DHF, as it's referred to in the literature.
That's exactly right. It's usually associated with dengue strain number 3. And they've had lots of deaths from this thing. And it usually is a disease of children and young adults, and it's very unfortunate because when you encounter that particular strain of dengue virus, not only do you get the breakbone fever-like syndrome, but you also develop hemorrhagic lesions throughout your body, and eventually you bleed to death. And it's a very horrible disease indeed.
So apparently being infected once increases your chances of developing hemorrhagic fever on a second infection.
So the literature suggests.
And we don't really understand the mechanism of that at all.
We do not. And so I think anybody listening to this would wonder, there's a great vaccine already for yellow fever, and that's a flavivirus. In fact, I think it's one of the best vaccines that's ever been devised.
Correct.
And dengue fever seems to be related very closely to yellow fever. Why don't we have a similar vaccine for dengue fever that we have already for yellow fever? Why haven't we been able to re-engineer the yellow fever virus with the missing parts from dengue virus to allow a super virus to be created that covers yellow fever, dengue fever? We could even make one for West Nile because that's related too. What's the stumbling block on this thing, do you think?
Well, I think it's being worked on. One of the issues is that pre-existing immunity is not protective against hemorrhagic fever. So the vaccine has to protect you against all 4 serotypes immediately.
Exactly.
Because if you were inoculated and only developed immunity against one, then you would have a high risk of getting hemorrhagic fever, especially in areas of the country where the mosquito is prevalent, and you could be infected within a week of being immunized, for example.
But as an interested listener, from last week's program, I learned that there are 3 different strains of polio, and we've got a vaccine against all 3.
Correct.
So here's just one more to add on to that. Why haven't we done that?
Well, in the case of polio, when you are infected with one serotype, and then you're subsequently infected with a second, say, there's no increased risk of a more severe disease or a disease of another kind as there is with dengue. It's a very unusual pathogen in that the second infections are much worse than the original.
Indeed.
So that is a bit frightening in terms of a vaccine, which is not to say that there is not research going on. It's quite active because, as you know, huge numbers of people we're talking about infected and susceptible to dengue in the world.
Exactly. So that raises the question of where do you find dengue, right?
All right, where do we find dengue?
Where could you possibly travel to avoid dengue, first of all? I would think dengue fever classifies as one of those true tropical diseases. If you look at the distribution maps that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have on their websites, you see that this is a disease that centers around the equator.
South of the equator?
That's on the equator, actually. If you draw the equator and then go above and below it, you've got about equal numbers of cases above and below it. Mm-hmm. But if you look at
where's the equator there, Dick?
the equator is on this map, it goes right through the middle
Brazil.
of South America. Yeah,
Okay.
right down through. Here's it.
Yes, I see.
Exits right over there. So the point is that here we have a tropical disease, but it's being introduced into subtropical regions, and so the United States, the southern part of the United States, classifies as a subtropical region. We have Aedes aegypti within the continental United States as we speak. Although, as we just discussed, if you just police up the area and get rid of these temporary standing bodies of water, you can greatly reduce the incidence of the mosquito. However, there's a little nuance here that we need to discuss. And that's another species of Aedes that's been introduced recently into the United States, which has become a competitor species for Aedes aegypti. And that is Aedes albopictus, otherwise known as the Asian tiger mosquito. And this brings us to a very interesting point in terms of environmental control. How did Aedes albopictus get introduced into the United States, do you think?
In tires that are filled with water?
That's correct. And where did those tires come from?
Somewhere else.
Correct. And why were they being brought to the United States?
Why we're importing tires? I thought we sold tires.
Yeah, we do. We do, actually. But if you're a tire maven and you live in a place where you can set up an industry of recovering old tires and turning them into new tires, then you can reestablish the tire industry in any place you want. So the United States, it turns out, and this is what the interesting part of infectious diseases is for me, it shows you how interconnected everything is, and it tells you about human behavior as well. So the United States sends huge numbers of worn-out tires to Japan. And Japan then retreads the tire and then sends them back to the United States for resale. Now, you might want to ask, why don't we just retread these tires ourselves? If we did, of course, then we would have avoided the introduction of a temporary body of water-breeding mosquito, namely Aedes albopictus.
Where was the origin of albopictus? Asia?
Japan. We know this because, why? Because you can do the genetics on the mosquito, and because there are varieties of species, you can pin down exactly where this mosquito came from, and it came from Japan.
Now, albopictus is all over the U.S. now, is that correct?
So it is, but Aedes aegypti isn't.
And you mentioned that albopictus is a competitor of
That's
aegypti. Does that mean that it's driving out aegypti from parts of the U.S.?
It actually does. It's a now you've got an ecological setting for measuring whether or not Aedes aegypti, the older treehole breeder, can outbreed an introduced new species that requires the same niche. So an ecological concept that's worth keeping in mind here is that no two different species can occupy the same niche. And here's proof positive.
It's sort of like matter, right?
Yeah. You either have energy or you have matter, but you can't have both at the same time. That's right. So what you have here is we're fortunate, by the way, that Aedes albopictus has been introduced and has pushed out Aedes aegypti because it's not as competent a vector for dengue.
For dengue, really.
So now you have an advantage of having albopictus hanging around. However, it's a much better vector for St. Louis encephalitis, for La Crosse virus, and maybe even perhaps for West Nile, because those are other flaviviruses that are ordinarily found in the environment where this mosquito now lives. So we still have a worry, but it's not as severe as if we were worried about dengue.
So the reason that dengue is sporadic in the U.S. is that it's imported in some way, probably in a tire or travelers. It spreads a bit, but then it burns out because it's not carried well by the mosquito population.
That's correct. So there's a big lookout for Aedes aegypti, and there's a recent lookout for albopictus as well, and that's when they discovered that all these old breeding sites for aegypti are now breeding sites for albopictus.
Okay. Now, why in countries near the equator, why is it persistent? Why is it endemic in these areas? It have to do with the fact that there are so many mosquitoes. They breed so well in these regions?
One is that. Two is the presence of humidity all the time and temporary rain. I mean, it rains almost every day in the tropics during the rainy season. And then in the non-rainy season, it rains sporadically. Now, just after the rainy season is when you would expect dengue outbreaks. Not during the rainy season, after the rainy season, right? Because the water has to dry down a bit. They lay their eggs around, then it rains again, and back up they come. I want to tell you about one introduction, which I think I mentioned the first time we talked, of dengue fever. It was in Bangladesh, of all places. In Bangladesh, prior to the introduction of dengue fever back in the 1990s, they had none. And you'd wonder how a country is so misfortunate to have so many endemic infectious diseases had avoided dengue fever. But the fact is that they had none. And then something horrible happened. A cyclone came through. And cyclones in the northern hemisphere have a counterclockwise rotation. And what this cyclone did was it picked up Aedes aegypti from the Malaysian peninsula and dumped it into Bangladesh. And from that point on, they've had endemic dengue fever in Dhaka.
Yes, we talked about that spreading West Nile after a hurricane in the U.S.
That's right, Hurricane Floyd. That's exactly right.
Now, I'm looking at a chart here, dengue since 1955, which is in a very nice article, which I'll post the link to on the website.
Good.
In the 1950s, less than 1,000 cases globally, and then suddenly increasing to where we have almost 1 million cases a year in over 50 countries. What's the reason for that? Why the increase? Is that the tire trade increasing, essentially, spreading the mosquito?
A lot of international trade, a lot of container shipping. They invented this Sealand system.
I see.
And
yes.
the Sealand, it's...
massive shipping of tires.
Correct.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
So previously, in the 1930s, actually, there was quite a bit more dengue, especially in South America. I'm looking at another map from the same article.
But it remained endemic in that area.
And then concerted eradication efforts to get rid of the vector, the mosquito.
I can speak about that in a minute, too, because they didn't just try to get rid of the Aedes aegypti mosquito, but they were really trying to get rid of Anopheles gambiae. And that was an introduced species from Africa.
And what's the problem with Anopheles gambia? What does it carry? This is the
world's best vector for malaria.
Malaria, okay.
So as long as they were getting rid of that one, they elected to get rid of this one too, and they got two for the price of one.
And we should point out that malaria is not a virus, but it is a parasite.
That's correct. It's a protozoan.
One of the biggest infectious diseases on the globe. Correct?
More people have died from that than from all the wars put together.
So that effort ended up reducing dengue by the 1970,
That's correct.
Then it reemerged because of the tire trade.
That's right. And other trade, too, and I would say the breakdown of public health systems in countries that were in conflict with themselves, civil unrest and war, and the drug trade, the illicit drug trade, I should say. These are ways of introducing things throughout the world that we are not in great control of, unfortunately.
So according to the World Health Organization, there are 50 million dengue infections globally.
Yep.
Every year. 500,000 deaths. 500,000 cases, 500,000 cases of hemorrhagic fever, and 22,000 deaths, mainly among children.
Exactly.
And the number at risk is in the billions because many people have been infected already once.
That's right.
The number at risk, I should say, for hemorrhagic fever is in the billions.
Right.
So this is obviously an urgent problem that needs a vaccine or some other approach, and there's a lot of research on this. Now, why is it mainly in children? Do you know?
These little kids are outside all the time, and they play in the environment where the temporary bodies of water are.
And they get bitten.
That's correct. They're easy victims.
So this brings up a thorny issue. There is some research on dengue in the U.S., but since it's not a problem here, maybe there is not as much as we should need, correct?
Well, you're right, and you're 95% correct. There is a group down in Galveston, Texas. They are the remnants of the arbovirology group that was originally at Rockefeller University, moved to Yale University, and then finally relocated down in Houston Galveston when the offer was made through the University of Texas. And they've had a remarkable success rate down there, and they were the ones that identified the first outbreaks of dengue within the United States back in the just before the turn of to 2000. It was about 1999, 1998 that they had their first outbreaks. So they're worried about it periodically being introduced, and it's being driven by weather events mostly.
Do you think it would be safe to say that at some point in the near future we will have more dengue in the U.S.?
Sure. I mean, look what happened in Galveston just recently. The hurricane that went through, Hurricane Ike, caused the complete evacuation of a city. They weren't allowed back in there for 2 weeks. All of that water just sat around and attracted who?
Mosquitoes.
Lots of them. There's no question about it. And as a result, it altered the ecology. And try to clean up after a hurricane sometime and see what that's like. I know I have some personal experience. I'm from New Orleans originally, so I went back after Katrina to try to do some work during our spring break the year afterwards, and all I ended up doing was demolishing a home down in Chalmette. And to see the devastation that something like that can bring to an entire region is just absolutely depressing. And to see, of course, even with maximum help that you get from government agencies, in this case we had none, but in other cases, I mean, for this latest outbreak of the hurricane that swept through and hit Galveston, there was lots of aid and lots of programs in place, and still you can't prevent these things from devastation. And disease outbreaks are just part and parcel of this. Now imagine what it would be like if you lived in, let's say, South Asia, like the southern part of India, for instance, and a cyclone comes through there, as happened when the tsunami hit. And then afterwards, now you've got breeding sites and people that are disoriented, no public health in place, no vaccines, no drugs, no water. You've got outbreaks of salmonella, you've got outbreaks of vector-borne diseases of various kinds. It's a horrible, horrible legacy.
Perhaps the hurricane in Galveston is the beginning of the real establishment of dengue in the U.S. Who knows? We'll see in the coming weeks and months. Perhaps we'll begin to see some infections there.
You know what the tropical disease people say about the best control measure for tropical diseases?
What's that?
Winter.
Yes. In Texas, the winter isn't terribly severe.
They can get snow.
It gets cold enough
sometimes
to keep the mosquito.
Yeah, they do.
But mosquitoes overwinter, as you know.
Do.
So that's
they
the
do.
problem. They never go away.
So another feature of this is the same as for all the flaviviruses. These are vertically transmitted as well as horizontally transmitted. And by that I mean the mosquito eggs from infected adult mosquitoes can have the virus.
Yes, and then the next mosquito born will have the virus.
So why don't these viruses kill these mosquitoes?
They've evolved in the mosquito for many years, and they're exquisitely adapted.
They are.
That's the ultimate strategy to grow in a host without killing it.
Yeah, these are sneaky little beasts.
Is there another host for dengue besides mosquitoes and humans? Are there any other animals that harbor it?
No, I think we're fortunate in the sense that dengue does not have reservoir hosts.
So that may make it more difficult for it to become established in the U.S., where we have a winter that really dampens the mosquito population.
This is one of the few exceptions, though. The flavivirus group in general have lots of reservoir hosts, including yellow fever.
Yes.
They've got monkey hosts, and so that's the way we introduce yellow fever from the jungle back into the human population. Whereas dengue fever, as far as we know, there are no reservoir hosts except we're it.
So the Albopictus mosquito is not terribly good host for dengue, but the virus could change so that it
could adapt.
It could adapt to this mosquito so that it is a better host.
Yeah, I mean, if we're unlucky enough to have an introduction of dengue in an area which has been displaced by Albopictus, and they are the recipients of this virus rather than Aegypti, you could very well see a new version of this in the future. So emerging infections.
Well, that's what might happen in Galveston. Albopictus is already in Galveston, correct?
It's all over the side.
So maybe we'll see more infections in the coming month.
Right.
The last thing perhaps we can talk about is climate change and dengue. What is the story with that, Dick? I have another picture here in this lovely article. Will climate change affect the spread of dengue in coming years?
I presume the answer is yes.
Yeah, it seems to be getting warmer.
So let's take two factors for mosquito breeding that are absolutely essential, and that is temperatures above freezing and water. You've got to have both of those things. So as the rapidity of the climate changes, okay, I think we're worried about not climate change, but the rapid climate change, all right? So rapid climate change. So by that, if I were an Aedes aegypti mosquito, I would be overjoyed at what's happening right now. I'd be absolutely jumping out of my my 6 little legs, trying to figure out how best I can grow myself in terms of the advantage that nature is now offering me. And the advantage is that there are places throughout the tropics that will receive more water, and therefore more rain events, and therefore more breeding sites that will be available for a longer period of time. And those areas will be warmer, so that my breeding season will be longer. Now, in the tropics itself, that's not a problem because the temperature never goes down below a certain level. But as the tropics extends itself, both towards the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer, you can understand now the zone of tropics now increases. And this is a tropical disease. And so as the tropics increases, so do their diseases. Dengue is not the only thing to worry about here.
Of course.
Now, there's a lot of other things out there that are waiting for us.
Sounds like I should work on dengue virus.
Well, if you could find a cure, or at least a vaccine for hemorrhagic fever, you'd be, I would be shaking your hand.
You know what the problem is, Dick? There's not a good animal model for hemorrhagic fever to do experiments in. A small animal in which you can infect and get the same kind of disease that we see in people. It just doesn't exist. And if someone could make that, it would help a lot.
So what would be the steps that you would, let's say you're starting from scratch here. You know nothing about dengue, you know nothing about the vectors, and you know nothing about its replication cycle. What would be your first questions to ask to develop an animal model?
Well, I would like to use a mouse because it's a mouse in the laboratory is very convenient. Try to get the virus to grow in mice.
And why don't you think it can grow now?
Well, I think it can grow in certain strains, but it's not a very typical infection. The receptor may not be present for the virus. There may be other proteins inside the cells of the mouse that aren't appropriate for dengue replication. So you really need to understand better what the virus needs and what's missing in a mouse. And that could take some time. But it's research worth doing, because if you can get the virus to infect, then perhaps you can start to work on getting the hemorrhagic fever part duplicated.
Right. Have they identified, at least in human cell lines, the receptor that the virus uses to gain entry?
Yes, the receptor is known. It's certainly present in mouse cells, so there must be other blocks to infection besides the receptor.
Once it gets in, maybe.
Once it gets in, yeah. But I have never worked on dengue. As you know, I work on picornaviruses, but it is a fascinating virus, and it's very important. The number of potential people who could get sick from this virus is huge, and it certainly merits even more research than we do at the moment on it.
Would you need a special lab to work on this, do you think?
No, I could work on dengue in my laboratory. Okay. The containment that we have, we could use. We could work on dengue.
Well, I happen to have been associated with the gentleman at the University of Notre Dame who actually championed the genetics of Aedes aegypti. His name was George Craig. And George Craig, actually, there was a book that he used as his foil, written by a guy by the name of Christopher. It was the complete biology of Aedes aegypti. And in this book, believe it or not, there was the blatant statement that there are no mutants of Aedes aegypti. Right, exactly. Here was a whole book about the biology, and right there in print it said, there are no mutants, don't worry about looking for them. So George Craig, knowing this, and laughed at the statement, enlisted a bunch of his undergraduates at the university to look for mutants, just like they did for fruit flies. At Columbia, that's where genetics began. We sit at the seat of the beginning of modern genetics, right? So they used fruit flies first, then George Craig picked up Aedes aegypti, and son of a gun if he didn't find tons of mutants, of course.
There are always mutants.
Yeah, so the point is that every time you went up to George Craig's laboratory, you made sure you had your DEET with you. Because some of those were escapees, and they would feed on the students. So that's why I was asking about a special laboratory. If you ever decided to do this for vector competency,
well, that's another issue.
P2 facility.
Yeah, for working with mosquitoes, then you need more, but just the virus itself.
Exactly.
So if I'm a American traveler and I'm going to a tropical zone, should I worry about dengue? And yes, and if so, what can I do to prevent being infected?
Well, you do the same thing that you do to prevent yourself from being infected with malaria from another vector that feeds. All right, you have to know the feeding zone for this mosquito. You have to know the time during the day or night that it feeds. Most malaria vectors feed at night, but this is a day-feeding mosquito. So How do you avoid being bitten by a mosquito? Period. You smear DEET all over yourself and hope for the best.
So if I go to Sao Paulo, Brazil, the city, walking around, do I need to take precautions?
It depends on the season, all right? These are seasonal outbreaks. So if this is during the rainy season, no. If it's just after the rainy season, absolutely. That's the absolute critical time for this. So you have to know what's going on there. So therefore, surveillance is everything. You have to check with the local health authorities. Now, how could you do that? Go to the CDC site.
They have information on.
They do.
The
they have a sort of like an emergency line or a hotline that you can call, and you tell them where you're going, and the next thing you know, they'll say, "Well, we have no recent reports of outbreaks from here." But by the way, just as an aside, wouldn't it be great if some service like, let me think, Google has Google Disease Earth?
Absolutely.
And you have a big menu on one side, you have the globe on the other side, and you click on dengue fever, and all the hot zones light up, and it's recent as yesterday.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
and then you can zoom in on the city and find out where they isolated the mosquito. Wouldn't that be a great service?
Fabulous.
Vince?
They have Google Earth already, which has photographs of the whole globe. That would be very good to integrate this with it. And we should discuss it with. I think they're very interested in doing this already, of course.
Let's hope they are.
I'd be interested in being a part of that, though.
Yeah, so would I, actually.
Okay, so anything else you'd like to say about dengue, Dick, before we say goodbye?
No, just that it will continue to be a problem.
It's very interesting.
And we should pay attention to it. So have you thought about next week's topic?
I haven't yet. We'll have to surprise everyone because there's so many things. We may just do news things because there's plenty of virus infections in the news. Yep. But there are many things we can do.
I'd like to discuss rabies next time if that's possible.
We could do rabies. You know why I'd like to discuss rabies?
Please.
Actually, on Sunday in the New York Times, there was a short article about an outbreak where some people ate an infected cow. So we'll talk about rabies. Great idea, Dick.
Okay.
What a pair.
Hey, and everybody out there, I'm not a virologist. Vince is.
Well, Dick is a smart guy. That's why he's here. I don't know why I'm here. Anyway, if you have, send us your questions and comments to TWiV at twiv.tv. Subscribe in iTunes. We're on iTunes now. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Okay. See you, Vince.